Hey friends, Mike Myers here with Songwriting for Guitar podcast, episode number 63, Josh Doyle. Now, I'm not sure why why has it taken me so long to have Josh on the podcast? Because we talk all the time. He is one of my mentors. Such a good friend. He's founder of the Sync Licensing Company record label and producers collective based in LA called 330 Music. He was the person that helped me understand a lot more of commercial songwriting, better my production skills. He's been and continues to be a huge mentor in my life. And yeah, I'm not sure why we haven't had him on yet. So we're going to do 2 episodes. So this is part 1 of my talk with my good friend and mentor, Josh Doyle. And we're not going to waste any time. We're just going to jump right into it. I can't believe it's taken this long to get you on the podcast. Your schedule is it's insane, Josh.
It's been a busy summer at least.
And I'm joking. I was joking, Josh. I can't believe I just didn't ask you. It's just like I only asked you until later because you seem like it would. Yeah. Why didn't I make you one of the first guests?
Well, I feel like we've done like a Zoom thing before. We've done like a couple of Zoom things, maybe, but not since you got the podcast. Not since
No. We've done stuff for the classes where I've had you as a guest. We've chatted, but yeah, nothing that's like, out there in podcast land, but you're here.
So it's like you've introduced me to your friends, but never your family. And I always, I was never offended by that. That's fine.
But I'm glad you're here because you were my first mentor for recording. It really was. Cause like I'd taken a class, but like you were the first. I was trying to go back in our messages the Facebook messages to go the very first one. I was like, what was the exact phrase you sent me? But before we get into that, I want to, I definitely want to get into like your background of how you got into, licensing, doing it professionally, doing it well, doing it for this long consistently, building a company, basically everything that you did. What was like that starting point? Because you live in LA, but you're originally from Indiana.
Right. Yeah. So when I moved out from Indiana to LA, I moved out here to be a session drummer. I wanted to tour and do studio work and stuff like that. And I started gigging with different artists, right?
Now, there, how did you make that jump? Because some people think I'll stay in the city that I live and still do music. What was the choice to, was it just like you were always had the idea, like I'm getting out of Indiana?
Well, I don't want to offend anybody. It's in Indiana. No, I basically just, I was really excited. Like, when I was a teenager, I started drums and I just kept wanting to get better.
Yeah.
And I started with, this is the answer to your question. I started with like one drum teacher, and at a certain point, I can't remember how, but I ended up like getting recommended to the next best drum teacher in town. And I'm like in a small town. It was Crawfordsville, Indiana. I think 30,000 people, something like that, small town. And then I was studying with that drum teacher for a while. And then I found out that my drum teacher was actually driving to Indianapolis to take lessons with an even better drum teacher. And then, so I eventually started doing that. I made the drive, like it was an hour drive. So 2 hours round trip every week to take these drum lessons. And he was great. He was a graduate of Indiana University and stuff like that. But basically my point is that I just started growing out of my pool. I could only get so good in the area that I was in. There was no more drum teachers there. And when I started going to Indianapolis, I was like, Indianapolis is the biggest city there is. Not that I ever got better than my drum teacher or anything. It just was like at a certain point, I started like gigging. I would start in my town, and then just like any other touring band or whatever, you start getting regional, and then you go like full state. And after a while, you've like done everything you can in your state. And so like that's kind of like why I ended up wanting to move to LA, because I just knew there was more opportunity for me there.
That's really interesting. That was like another level. But like, I feel like you still do that. Like you just realize like, oh, it's just like a higher level. There's no mountaintop.
Yeah. And, I don't want to get us, we can go off on all these things here, but this morning I was kind of getting myself in the mood for our conversation. So I was listening to a couple episodes of your podcast, and I really like those little like 7 or 8 minute episodes where you just go hard on one topic. And that one, you had one about like being curious, like the importance of being curious and having that drive, and what happens if you don't have that. You're just kind of like, it's not fun, and it's not gonna end up well. Yeah, and so basically I've just always been curious about that next level, about like
Yeah.
what happens after this, like what, yeah, that kind
It's
of
like
thing.
when people make money, they think $1,000 is a lot, but when they make $1,000, they're like, well, $5,000. And when they get $5,000, they're like, okay, there's always another level. So it's just like, you realize you're doing the thing you want to do if you're always curious about like, well, what does this look like? What does the next one look like? Yeah. I love that. So then you move to LA. So you go out.
Yeah. So I go out, I remember on my drive from Indiana to Los Angeles, my band had broken up in Indiana, like my high school band, and just a bunch of stuff that just kind of was a catalyst for this. And I remember on the drive saying, I'm not going to join any more bands. I'm only going to be a work for hire, like hired gun kind of thing. But the first thing I do when I get to LA is I join this band. But after that, anyway, I ended up going to the Los Angeles, had a different name, Los Angeles Academy of Music. Now it's Los Angeles College of Music or something like that. Mm-hmm. Did that for a couple years. And then that gave me the skill set to start playing for different artists as a hired gun, doing tours. And then this gets me into the sync thing, which is I started drumming for these artists, and then just naturally found myself able to write with some of them. And just like how it goes, you write a bunch of songs over a tour or something like that, and only some of them get used for the album that they're working on. Yeah. At the end of the year after the tour ends. And I started kind of, when your favorite song or whatever doesn't make the cut, doesn't make the album, you're like, oh man, that was such a good song. Why didn't it make it? And then you start thinking like, well, what could I do with this? It doesn't have to stay with this artist. They didn't want it. And they're totally cool with it. That's just the nature of it. You can't have like a 50 song album. So eventually I started thinking like, oh, if I could my first thought was like, what if I pitch these to other artists, and get it like as a
like a cut somewhere, someone else does it. Yeah.
Yeah, that kind of thing. And, when I talked to the artists that I was writing with, they loved that idea because, that's just songs sitting on the shelf that are never going to get used. And that was never my niche, the pitching to other artists or other managers or labels. But the sync thing started to really come together because I had a history in writing and producing my own albums and stuff like that. So I was like, man, if I could produce these songs out myself, hire a singer to come and like do it, I could start pitching to music supervisors, get placements and stuff like that. So that was the long game. I was still touring, I was still focused on drumming, but in the background I was kind of like, if I could pitch these songs.
How did you stumble on the idea of licensing?
I think my very first thing was hearing that story of Paul McCartney telling Michael Jackson that Paul McCartney was giving advice to Michael Jackson, telling him that the money's in publishing.
And then Michael buys the Beatles catalog.
Yeah, exactly. Then Michael buys the Beatles catalog. And so when I heard that, I was like, ooh, the money's in publishing. What's publishing? And so I kind of dug into that. Even still, like, what is a publisher? What do they do? Is still a bit of a question mark after. I mean, sometimes they do a lot, sometimes they don't. But sync licensing is one of the things that publishing.
I love that story of like how they connected at first. Did you know like Michael called Paul McCartney, got his number and called him. He was like, Paul, it's Michael Jackson. Paul was like, yeah, you're no, it's not. And hangs up, gets another call. And then he's just like, hey, I want to know if you want to write some hits.
Oh, that's
and so they end up writing like a ton, but then, then he just buys the Beatles catalog and Paul tries to like talk to him about it. And Michael is just like, it's just business, and just blows them off.
Oh man.
And that's the only time they've ever talked. I love that you brought up that story because it's such a weird story of how Michael Jackson acquired the Beatles catalog because Paul told him like publishing, and he was like, oh, I'll buy the Beatles catalog.
Yeah, that sounds like a good one to have. That's one I'll pick up. I'll throw. But
that's interesting. So then you got into the idea of publishing. Maybe there's that, and then through there you discovered like licensing through TV and film.
Yeah, I started pitching kind of like during the off time when I wasn't, on the road or whatever, wasn't working. Mm-hmm. And I could go all different kinds of ways with this, but essentially I was starting to pitch because I was playing with so many different artists. I play with pop or singer-songwriter, kind country, whatever. And I started pitching all these like to the same music supervisor. I'd be like, hey, I've got 3 songs. One's like country, one's hardcore rap,
Yeah, yeah.
whatever I was playing for. And they would literally like reply like, who are you? Are these your songs? Like, why are you sending me 3 like drastically different
Different
styles?
genres. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was a newbie, and I totally understand. Like they basically didn't understand like what my niche was. Like
Yeah.
what am I representing, whatever. And so eventually I learned that this would make much more sense if I was a record label. If I was a record label and I signed all these artists, I could pitch Jay-Z and Taylor Swift and whatever to the same music supervisor, and they'd be like, oh yeah, thanks, this is great. So I started 3 Theory Music for that purpose. And then I would just start pitching stuff under the 3 Theory Music label. And I started to find more success. They kind of understood that I was representing catalogs of music. And it allowed me to just not limit myself to like a certain thing. I could write in all these different styles, produce in all these different styles.
Hey, it's Mike. I just wanted to jump in the middle of this episode because you're hearing things about licensing, you're hearing things about production, and maybe you're just starting your journey in licensing. You're interested in the idea of like getting your stuff into TV, or maybe you're just starting your production journey and you're like, I need to know more. I wish I could watch somebody make tracks that are syncable, ask them questions, ask people about pitching solutions. Well, guess what? That's why we started the Insiders track with my good friend and amazing sync artist, Heather Evans. We go live. I go live twice a month and I build out tracks in real time that I'm using for briefs. That's things for TV and music. And you can ask me questions. Then Heather goes live twice a month answering your questions on pitching. She has topics especially related to her artistry career and how she's using sync as the advantage. So if you're listening to this and you're like, well, Mike, guess what? I want to do this. I want to join. If you use the promotion code Podcast Insiders, you'll get the first 30 days completely free on us. This is going to be super helpful. We want you to learn. Heather and I wish we had this when we started our journey, and that's why we created this. So remember, Podcast Insiders, you can join completely free. So head on over to songwritingforguitar.com to sign up and join now. I think this was when you were in Indiana. You told me like the first like Pro Tools setup you got, because it's like Sweetwater is right in like it's Fort Wayne, Indiana, which everybody I think forgets. Whenever you see like that call on your phone, Fort Wayne, Indiana, it's like your Sweetwater rep being like, "Hey, Mike, it's just Jimmy. I just want to call up and just see you checking in, make sure you're doing good." But the best piece of advice you ever gave me was like, when you buy something new, don't buy anything else. Just stay with that one thing and really know it. Because I think it was, you told me about how before you set up Pro Tools, you read the manual. You were like, I read it from beginning to end.
Yep.
And then I started it.
Yeah, I have this habit. I'm working on another business now where I'm kind of doing that same thing. Anything that I know is going to be a big project, like just lots of points of failure, I will do that kind of thing of like not open any boxes, not get into it, and just try and read and learn in the big kind of umbrella scope of, I know that there's certain things, like I did that. Like I bought my Pro Tools system and it sat outside my studio door in boxes until I read the entire book. And honestly, maybe 2/3 of the book didn't make any sense because I had no point of reference of like what they were talking about in the software or whatever. But when it did come time to setting it up, it did like kind of a little light bulb. It was like, oh, they were talking about this thing. And then I would go back and get my book, and it just made the process quicker when I wasn't trying to set up and learn and do all of it all at once. Yeah.
Because like, that's the thing now, you're successful at what you do as producer, songwriter, business owner. It's like all the different hats you wear. Mm-hmm. But like, how did you get the idea of like, I have to buy all my equipment? Like, I just have to just get this and just do this.
I was frustrated. And this is like a point that is going to come up a lot at different points in my life. Everything comes from frustration of me being frustrated that like when I have to rely on other people and they don't have the same passion for it that I do, or I can't communicate my vision to them, which is my failure. Or just whatever. Like when I got my Pro Tools set up, it was my band had broken up in Crawfordsville, in my small little town, and I was frustrated. I was like, I was frustrated kind of in that same way that comes later when I was writing with all those artists where those songs were just sitting on a shelf. I was like, I just spent like 5 years writing with this band, and now we broke up, and all those songs, they've just vanished. Like, nobody's ever going to use those songs again. That was just a waste, like,
Yeah.
if that was a business, if that was a factory or whatever, and you were making little doodads, widgets, whatever, you wouldn't just like, if the company failed, you wouldn't just like burn everything. You would have like some value left over, right?
I wish a company would do that. It's like, guys, we made 1 million doodads.
Yeah.
What do we do? Fuck it. Let's burn it. We're just done.
Yeah. Well, we broke up, man. We're a band. Let's just burn everything. So that's what made me I was like, if I had control over my own songs, I could write my own album. So I literally walked down to a small town bank. I still have no idea how I qualified for the loan, but they gave me a $5,000 loan, and I drove to Sweetwater and bought like a whole Pro Tools setup, one mic, a computer, the whole thing. And so well, actually, sorry. Before I did that, I started recording at a little studio there in town, and I was recording my, a few songs that I had written. And I started getting, again, frustrated that I would have to go back into the studio just to have like a tambourine lowered in volume.
Yeah.
And it would cost me another like $50 just to do that. And I was like, man, if I just had the session and I knew what I was doing and I had the software, I could make these little tweaks. I don't need to like read. That's really how it started. I was like, I just want to like lower the tambourine. So I was like, I'm going to take out
which
a
totally makes sense
loan.
because the amount of like, I realized how much thousands I spent in the studio of just like getting things that were okay.
Mm-hmm.
But man, like now I wish we would have done this. I wish we would have done this. Or when we did want to do that, we were like, well, it's going to cost another. So do we really want to do this? And it's like, okay.
Yeah.
So even though we know it might make it better, it's going to cost. And there was always like, they'd be like, I remember the Pro Tools session. You'd be like, all right, brothers, I got to bounce this. And then so the bouncing would take like 20 minutes. We'd be like, what the hell is he talking about? This is taking forever.
Yeah. That just cost us $35.
It is. It was insane, but it was just like, because we assumed that was how you do it. But this idea of like, I feel now it's a lot more accepted to just like, oh yeah, record. But I feel even you weren't that far back in the day, but like so much has changed even in the past 10 years.
Totally.
That like, to think like, what year was that? And you bought your first Pro Tool setup?
It was like 2001. So it's been a while.
2001. I remember just like, I think even in 2000, that was like what cable internet was a new thing. That was that's what's crazy. Texting wasn't even like widely accepted yet. It's crazy as it was, but home recording wasn't like a huge thing that everybody had the capability of doing.
No, not at all.
And so like thinking about that is so valuable because it's like, that's almost like a business person too, because they have to think like long-term, what's the best investment and what's my return long-term going to be? And not just like, do I get some songs done at the local studio now? But what if I take the time to learn this?
Right. And I also want to say that, it really is personality dependent because like there could be an argument for, I don't know, maybe the money ended up being the same in terms of like the amount of money I've spent like on gear for my studio compared to what I would have spent just like going and recording my albums with somebody else and having them all do it for me might end up being the same, so I don't know if it's necessarily,
Well, what? It's kind of like you paid for your own education because that's the other side where I'm like, well, you took the time to master that craft and that skill. Like how many people are like, they graduate high school and then they sign their names to loans that are like $300,000 that they're never going to pay back for a major in Russian literature that they're never going to use. And before you know it, they're managing the gap. It's just like, or Hollister. When I went to apply for Hollister once, at 19, they were like, you need a college degree.
What?
Yeah, you do to be a manager.
Oh, manager. Okay. Yeah.
I like how you're like, oh, manager. Yeah, of course.
Oh, manager. That's the Hollister.
That's complete. And I was like, of anything? And they were like, yeah, anything. So I feel like even though, if somebody said, if you would have said, I went to college and I got da-da-da degree, they would have been like, oh, you helped, further yourself. But I think like some of the things in the routes that we ended up doing, some would say at first like, you didn't save that money. But it's like, but the investment long term has then came out as us having these skills
That's
that
true.
we
Yeah,
can
definitely.
use and monetize. The Russian literature for some, it's been a struggle. It's been a rough year.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's a rough area to get into.
Now, early on, especially with licensing, did you notice like, just how you talked about the etiquette of pitching, that you had to like, okay, now I'm going to, establish this record label, which is my business. And now here are the things I need to do. Starting your own record label, did that help slowly over time get more placements a little bit? Just like, or the quality of your pitching got better because it got refined, because you started to learn like, oh, this is how I should be doing it.
Yeah, I think that when I started the company, I knew that it was going to solve or address the immediate question that I was constantly getting of like, kind of like, who are you? Why are you sending us all this different music? Like I could just literally say, I'm Josh from 3 Theory Music, we're a sync label, and then they would get it immediately. Because before it was like 3 paragraphs of like, well, I'm a drummer who plays for artists and I also write songs with them. And so I play with all these different artists. It was just like, forget it. But I also knew that setting up the company would solve a lot of problems in the future and allow me to scale and allow other people to work under that umbrella.
Yeah.
And the other big thing, once I started getting syncs, that I was a little bit frustrated by before was that if I had my own little side project, like I've got one called The Upsided, that's me and my songwriter friend Emily Herndon. We've gotten a pretty decent number of syncs under The Upsided.
Yeah.
The problem is that doesn't do anything for any of my other side projects. I can't really like pitch Disable Danger, which is another side project, like a rock band of mine, and give any of the credits, any of the hard work that's been accomplished by me to this other thing. So, but I could, if all these bands were under the umbrella of 3 Theory Music, I could pitch it as 3 Theory Music and be like, we've had Nintendo placements, Google placements, whatever. And it can be a new, unproven artist, but I can still have them under the
umbrella, where it's like all the accolades are all under one kind of like roof, that you could be like, hey, our artists have gotten placements on da-da-da. And it's like, oh shit. Okay.
Yeah. Even if it's not that specific artist that I'm pitching.
Yeah.
That was like a big thing for me. I knew I could, tie those things together. And I feel like that had a big role to play in the success that I've had.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that is really smart thinking too, long term, that it's like, you're right, because like one band could say, hey, we've gotten this, but that doesn't, that you can't say that for the other one. But when you have that one entity saying like, hey, we represent these artists who have all gotten placements on, suddenly that roster looks like, oh, okay, that's pretty damn good.
Yeah, when you grammatically word it in a way that lets everybody live under the family of that one thing, then everybody can kind of share in the successes of each other, And
I feel this gave you play and room for like genre hopping a little bit of things that you like.
Yeah, and this goes back to early on when I first started as a drummer just playing in bands. I love, and I still love, playing in different styles. Like, I could never be that guy. I could never be in the Rolling Stones and you just play Rolling Stone style rock music for your entire life and never play anything else. I always loved the different genres and writing in different styles and stuff like that.
Well, it's because like I always feel sometimes it's unfair for musicians, because actors can play different roles and they get to, nobody criticizes if they, 1 minute like are in this movie, but then they do this theater role and then they jump around. They're like, is multi-talented, but like an artist does that, stick with one. And it's like, oh man, really just
That's
one?
why, I know. That's why I admire greatly the artists who can do that. Like Taylor Swift, if you really listen to like where she started and then what she's ended up at and now come kind of back to, like her recent album is like kind of more singer-songwriter folk. And the fact that she's still had hits on every single album
one
as she's done it. Like, because I think about all the different artists that haven't been able to make those hops. They end up alienating their fan base.
We're almost coming out like, because you and I talked about like, our past of just like teaching and, just teaching one-on-one private lessons for kids. I think of Taylor Swift and I'm like, okay, I remember when I started teaching, it was Never Getting Back Together.
Yeah.
And then we moved on, and then there was 22, and then we moved on a little bit later. And then it was, you had things like Bad Blood, Shake It Off, Bad Blood.
Yeah.
And then suddenly we move on to the folklore realm, and it's just like, shit, she went all across the spectrum. But that was a hit single. 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 Okay.
Yeah, and even her like first 2 albums were really in the country, like very country, So I don't know. There's other artists that have been able to do that kind of thing.
But she is the one presently, I will say that yeah, you're right, does it really, really well.
Yeah.
She could come out tomorrow with like, I don't know, like, a takeout record where it's just her ordering takeout. And it's just like, people are just like, oh shit, this is so good. Did you hear? She just ordered that.
Those fries, that's the hook right there.
That was it right there. Oh, what is it? That's Tenacious D. I think they do that. Right. There's like a drive up one, their first record. And that does it for this week. Next week, don't forget, part 2 of my talk with Josh Doyle is going to keep on going. This episode was edited and produced by Chris Fafalius. I'm Mike Myers. Thanks for listening.